She was an all-American fantasy designed to capture the hearts of men all across the country. Flirtatious, but fiercely independent. Seductive, yet she always left something to the imagination. We know her today as the pinup girl. Most people picture her plastered on bomber planes during World War II. But her story actually begins well before that. And oddly enough, it all started with the invention of the bicycle. Hey y'all, I'm Christina, this is Stella, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. So I got the idea for today's episode from a TikToker. Now her handle is the Historical Harlot, and that's because she's a researcher at a historical former brothel, and she was responding to a commenter who felt that pinups were objectifying women.
So this is a comment that was left on a video,
and she was explaining how it was a bit more nuanced than that and how important it is to put yourself in the mindset of the men and women who lived during World War II rather than looking at it through a modern lens if you really want to get a feel for what it was about and to understand. So in that video, she talked a bit about the history of the pinup, and it just really inspired me to look into the subject more. So I'll link her video if you guys are interested. But that was the inspiration for me to look into this subject, and it certainly did not disappoint. Pinup art is an image of an attractive person that a viewer would pin to a wall so that they could enjoy looking at it as they pass by. The genre originally involved females and was also called cheesecake as a metaphor for something sweet. With increasing acceptance of these types of images, the subgenre of beefcake, which was attractive men, emerged. So when we think of pinup girls, for many of us, our minds immediately go to a particular style, which is a style that was arguably the most popular, especially during World War II, was the style that was first popularized in the 1920s and 30s. This was the girl next door or the everyday woman style of pinup. These women were depicted as innocent and coy with just a hint of sensuality. While sometimes certain body parts were still portrayed in an unrealistic or even unattainable fashion, these women were typically posed in everyday settings such as at the beach or the park and were often portrayed as wholesome and all-American. No matter the artist and their differing styles of how modest or revealing the outfits, pinup girls all have one thing in common. They embody the fantasy of catching a glimpse of something that you're really not supposed to be seeing. The pinup girl's demeanor is a big part of the allure. It's the seductive yet somehow still innocent look in her eye. She's the object of desire, yet she's still just the sweet girl next door who really has no idea what she does to you. Pinup girls are one of the most iconic and enduring symbols of the 20th century that really came into the height of their popularity during World War II, as many men were serving overseas used these pinup girls to boost morale and provide a sense of comfort and familiarity. Familiarity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's backtrack about half a century or so. The origins of pinup girls can be traced back to the late 19th century when French and American artists began creating images of beautiful women for magazine covers and advertisements. These images were often stylized and romanticized, depicting women as ethereal beings rather than realistic representations of the female form. While they were not called pinups, advertising posters featuring attractive women became popular in Paris in the 1890s. Artists portrayed women in a very sexual way, sometimes even completely nude. Of course, France was doing that sort of thing well before the United States. But between the 1860s and the 1940s, burlesque performances were popular in the United States. These were a sort of variety show where women performed on stage by singing, dancing, or acting as she slowly began a striptease. Women began to take photographs of themselves unclothed or partially clothed to use as their resume to get jobs as burlesque performers. In some of these photos, they used the same method that you see in the artwork, where they are partially covered up and leave something to mystery. Even though this is still technically stripping, burlesque performers are usually partially clothed even by the end of their tease. While to me this definitely sounds much more risque than how pinup started, it's relevant to note as it did come before the pinup era. Burlesque performances are still considered far more tame than other types of striptease and remain popular in cities like Las Vegas. The term pinup was first documented in English usage in 1941. However, the practice is documented back to at least the 1800s, and oddly enough has been attributed by some to have started with the invention of the safety bicycle. The first commercially successful two-wheeled human-propelled machine was invented in the early 1800s. The term bicycle was coined in France in the 1860s, and I say good riddance because saying two-wheeled human-propelled machine is a mouthful. Bicycles in the 1870s and 1880s were called penny farthing. Farthing? Is that right? Were called penny farthing, high wheel, or an ordinary bike. These bikes had a large front wheel, and riders were able to travel long distances at much higher speeds than before. They had solid rubber wheels, and because of this, the only shock absorption was in the saddle of the bike. The very large front wheel and much smaller back wheel meant that the rider's center of gravity was only slightly behind the large front wheel, making these bikes very hazardous for riders as they were at a high risk of flying over the handlebars. In fact, this was such an issue that flying over the handlebars of your bike became known as a header. Some companies began trying to improve on the design of this bicycle, while others set about completely reinventing the device, which led to the invention of safety bicycles. Much like modern-day bicycles, these bikes had two small wheels of equal size, a chain driver, and gears. Soon after safety bicycles came onto the scene, the wheels were improved, and in the 1890s, the brakes were also improved. All of this led to a boom in sales, which caused production of bicycles to go from 200,000 in 1889 to 1 million the very next year. And while some women had attempted to ride the old, ordinary bicycles, their long skirts and cumbersome undergarments made it nearly impossible to ride and downright dangerous. So when these new and improved safety bikes were invented, they quickly caught the eye of Western women in the early 19th century. As the American population had become increasingly urban, women became dependent on male family members for transportation. A bicycle gave late Victorian women the freedom to go off on their own as far and as fast as she could pedal, unaccompanied by a chaperone. Which meant that bicycles began to represent freedom for these women who could now come and go as they pleased, whether it was to work outside the home or to participate in social causes. But there was still a problem. 19th century floor-length dresses and skirts, not to mention the pounds of undergarments, weren't exactly suited for riding a bicycle. Now, the story goes that soon after bicycles hit the scene, women stripped off their petticoats and layered skirts in favor of bloomers and boots. And this is credited with ushering in a major shift in women's fashion. Only that may not be entirely accurate. According to researcher Dr. Caitlin Stark-Kahn, who has done extensive research in this area, the whole tossing aside of the corsets and wearing bloomers as pants thing wasn't quite as mainstream as we have been made to believe. Dr. Kahn believes this misconception comes from the abundance of drawings from this time period that depict women riding bikes in their bloomers. However, she says the majority of these drawings are making fun of the idea of women wearing such clothing. Now, of course, we do have plenty of written records to prove that some women did in fact ride their bikes in their bloomers, and we even have stories of women who were refused service for arriving at a place of business in their bloomers. But for the majority of women, jumping straight from wearing 14 pounds of clothes to wearing their undergarments as pants was a bit extreme. Wearing bloomers without a skirt was considered peculiar and immodest. And while women wanted to ride bikes, the majority still cared about their reputation and dressing modestly. So, what did they wear? Typically, women wore shortened skirts, although how short could vary widely. Some skirts were only 3 inches above the ground, whereas some daring women might wear a skirt that fell just below the knee, with the average length being somewhere between lower calf and ankle length. Some women also wore skirts that were divided, almost like extra wide culottes, which, if you don't know, those are like super wide leg capri pants. I just read that culottes are making a comeback, which honestly sounds terrible. These new skirts required much more fabric, but some writers believed that they were safer and kept women's skirts in place. Now, the ideal divided skirt would look just like an ordinary skirt. Women typically wore matching or coordinated jackets for cycling, but they would also wear a shirtwaist or blouse tucked into their skirt. Some of the jackets had boning for added structure, and some women continued to wear corsets, although tight lacing them was not recommended. There were also special bicycling corsets. Of course, that could have just been a marketing tactic for companies who were trying to sell more corsets. Some women started wearing less structured corsets, or what were called health corsets, which could have less boning or even have cording in place of metal bones. Now, if you've ever seen photos of women wearing those divided or split skirts, you probably thought they were just regular everyday dresses because that's what they looked like. Of course, that was the intention, but they had a lot of functional differences. These outfits were called cycling costumes and tended to be made out of sturdy wool, though they were made of linen as well. Some of the unique features included leather stitched around the hem, which would protect the skirt from ripping if it got caught, and presumably also made it harder for the chain to catch the skirt. There were multiple different styles of these outfits or cycling costumes for the women who had the inclination or the means, which if you were wealthy enough to own a bike, you could probably afford the cycling costume to go along with it. Now, as you can probably guess, there was an immediate public uproar about the ladies sitting astride a bicycle. Not only did you have some women donning more revealing clothing, but doctors and ministers campaigned against bicycles for safety reasons, saying that the bouncing of the bicycle could damage a woman's fragile internal structure and the, quote, feminine organs of matrimonial necessity. End quote. For some reason, they were also super worried that the friction from the bicycle seat might cause women to become aroused, which I never have been able to understand why these guys seem to have such a concern about that back in the day. But despite all of this opposition, women were hooked, and they started calling bicycles freedom machines. And as the bicycle helped to change the self-perception of women in the 1890s, more women joined the suffragettes or women's rights movement as they began to see themselves as deserving of the same rights as men. And the rational dress movement, which began in the late 19th century and was aimed at reforming women's clothing for increased comfort and practicability, was also further fueled by the bicycle, which is believed to be what gave this movement what it needed to stick. The women's suffrage movement and the bicycle became so linked that Harvard students burned an effigy of a woman on a bicycle to protest women who were marching for the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony cheerfully told reporter Nellie Bly that bicycling, quote, has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world, end quote. Adding that it gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel, the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood. In 1895, Life magazine illustrator Charles Dana Gibson forever changed the future of women's fashion with images of what he saw as the feminine ideal of beauty. This was inspired in part by his wife and what he considered to be a composite of thousands of American girls. These so-called Gibson girls are now widely accepted as the first pinup. Drawn with a sizable bust and itty-bitty waist, the Gibson girl had full lips, a swan-like neck, and masses of dark hair piled precariously on top of her head. But what really brought the Gibson girl to life was her clearly defined personality. She was based on the new woman, one that was self-assured, put together, sensual, and intelligent all at once. She wanted independence, but not too much independence. Like, she was all about doing new things, but not necessarily out there campaigning for the vote. There was also a Gibson man that was created to go along with the Gibson girl, but much like Barbie and Ken, nobody really cared about him. The Gibson girl is where it was at. She was the one that people wanted to pin up on their walls. And the Gibson girl quickly became the ideal standard of Western beauty, some even say the first standard of beauty, with her face plastered all over magazines and newspapers. Women donned the Gibson girl-esque hairdos and S-bend corsets, which sucked in women's waist while simultaneously pulling women's backs forward by pushing both the chest and butt out at the same time, which gave off the appearance of that extreme hourglass figure that the Gibson girl was known for. The Gibson girl became a national icon. She was, in a sense, the first dream girl who was unattainable aside from pinning her up on your wall. These pictures in the pages of Life magazine ran for the next 20 years and inspired countless imitators. And as printing technology advanced, more and more magazines began featuring images of what most would consider unattainable beauty ideals. And for the first time in the United States, men had an easily obtainable source of female fantasy at their fingertips. Given the reality that sexual attractiveness makes for effective advertising, one of the earliest applications of pinup art was in calendars that were intended to be hung on walls. In 1889, Thomas Murphy and Edmund Osborne printed the first calendar featuring ads beneath the images. The concept was genius as it offered companies an entire year of ad space. Now, the first calendar featured an image of George Washington, which, unsurprisingly, didn't do so hot. It took them a few years longer to come up with the idea of selling sexual attractiveness with their calendars. But in 1903, the first girl calendar was released. The outbreak of World War I saw the end of the Gibson girl. Women stopped wearing the S-bend corsets as they started having to take jobs that had typically been done by men. And as it turns out, you need a working spine to do those kinds of jobs. Women needed to be able to move about freely without any of their clothing getting in the way, which led to women wearing more practical, masculine clothing than before, further progressing the rational dress movement. What would become the familiar pinup began to take shape in 1917 when the Wilson administration created the Division of Pictorial Publicity during the war. This division mobilized all media outlets in the creation of propaganda that would further the U.S. war effort by stirring up patriotism and inspiring new troops to fight. As we all know, sex sells, and in the early 20th century, the U.S. started using it for propaganda posters. One of the main tropes of these posters was pretty women dressed in sexy military ensembles and announcing messages like, "Gee, I wish I was a man, I'd join the Navy," and "Be a man and do it." Once men returned home from war, the women in the 1920s were not willing to give up the freedoms that they had experienced while their husbands were away. The free-spirited flapper generation was wild, free, and eager to show some skin. The age of jazz brought with it shortened hymns, spiked illegal alcohol, bobbed hair, and a heightened sense of youthful rebellion. Artists like Rolf Armstrong responded to this trend, dressing his pinup girls all the more scantily as well. Calendar artists followed and helped shape these changes in dress and attitude. Over time, the women's pinup became much more teasing and flirtatious. The 1920s gave us some of the most famous African-American pinup models who were also burlesque performers, like Josephine Baker and Lottie Graves. These women became symbols of the jazz age in both France and the United States, and they are still idolized to this very day for their beauty and grace. When George Petty joined the fledgling magazine Esquire, he had already been airbrushing and illustrating for sexed up adverts and calendars for years. And when he added his expertise to this magazine, it became an immediate hit. Petty's drawings that were placed on a double page in the middle of a magazine and could be easily torn out to pin up on the wall, coining the term centerfold. His characters became known as Petty Girls, and they were the classic all-American girl next door, just made extra sexy. She was curvy with legs that went on for days. But what made the Petty Girl so popular was the way that she was placed in the reader's world. She was posed in idealized everyday scenarios, doing normal everyday things like chatting on the phone, celebrating holidays, or even working jobs that had typically been done by men. And this version of the pinup girl is the one that went from bedroom walls to being taken overseas by soldiers looking for comfort while heading off to war. It was easy to imagine the petty girl as a childhood sweetheart or teenage crush. After all, that was the whole point of their design. Many of these soldiers simply dreamed of living long enough to return home and be with a woman again someday. And just like that, pinup went from being in magazines to being painted on the sides of bombers. Nose art is a term that refers to a decorative painting that was typically placed on the front fuselage of an aircraft. While this began for the practical reason of identifying friendly units, the practice evolved into a way of expressing individuality and evoking memories of home and peacetime life. The erotic nature of some of these paintings was also expressed in the names that were painted alongside the illustrations, like Never Satisfied and Vicky the Vivacious Virgin. And the longer the war continued, the more explicit the illustrations became. Part of the appeal was said to be the fact that this nose art was not officially approved. However, regulations against it were not typically enforced. And while it's largely a military tradition, some civil airliners have got in on the action over the years. Cartoons and pinups were most popular among American artists, but other works included animals, nicknames, hometowns, and popular songs and movie titles. Some nose art and slogans expressed contempt for the enemy, especially for the leaders. Soldiers often named their military trucks and aircraft after loved ones back home as yet another reminder of what they were fighting for. And some soldiers even tattooed themselves with images of pinup girls. But perhaps the ultimate association of the sexy woman and war came when pinups started being painted on the bombs that were being dropped from these planes. The bomber that dropped the first atomic bomb on June 6, 1945 was said to have been named Enola Gray after the pilot's mother, and Rita Hayworth was reportedly drawn on the bomb that was dropped. In the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood stars copied the pinup style and switched from modest gowns to wearing form-fitting outfits that showed off their figures. They often had curly bleach blonde hair and wore bright red lipstick. They smiled constantly, and just like the pinup girls, if they did something cute or flirty, it was never on purpose to seduce a man. They were supposed to be innocent of their own allure, which made them all the more attractive. Now, when we look back at these movies through our modern lens, we may see these women as appearing very classy. But back then, a lot of people saw them as way too vulgar. By the 1940s and 50s, pinup was everywhere. Petty style drawings were used to sell magazines to men, but they were also marketed to women, selling everything from fashion, homeware, and films. MGM even made a film about the drawings titled Petty Girl. As popularity grew, so did the amount of artists getting in on the action, and they all had a slightly different take on what made the perfect woman. One of these artists, Gil Evgren, created some of the most iconic pinup girls. Their style was characterized by their playful, flirtatious, and somewhat funny poses, which added to their charm. Elfgren loved using vibrant colors and lifelike detail to bring his girls to life. He leaned heavily on the idea of placing his models in even more average, everyday scenarios like cooking, decorating, or even just holding cute animals. Something he was known for that you might recognize was the way that he placed his models in situations where they might be flashing their underwear, but it was always an accident. She wasn't doing it on purpose. The poor thing had tripped. If I had a nickel for every time I tore my dress on a dang random crane that was just hanging out in the middle of the sidewalk. His style was considered very cheesecake, portraying his pinup girls as sweet and innocent. But at the same time, they were very sexy. He was also known for his masterful manipulation of the female form. He'd have models pose for pinup photos and then set his pencil to work, nipping, tucking, and enlarging certain key assets until he had the perfect fantasy. Now, as I touched on several times already in this episode, World War II captured the pinnacle of pinups. The U.S. government carefully designed the use of the all-American pinup to boost morale. She was the sweetheart that was waiting for him at home. For some men, these pinups were more than just a fantasy. They saw them as actual representations of their mothers, sisters, and sweethearts, the ones they were truly fighting for. These pinup photos were found posted inside barracks, hung in submarines, and tucked into soldiers' pockets. And of course, the government used the popularity of pinups to work into their propaganda. There were good pinups that were mostly clothed and sometimes wore military-style uniforms. These women encouraged troops and those at home to buy war bonds and participate in the war effort. And then there were the bad pinups, who were more provocative in their posing and had less clothing. The Army would use the bad pinups posing or imagery in posters and pamphlets to warn soldiers away from loose women, venereal disease, and espionage. Pinup propaganda was also used on women as symbols of productivity in the war effort to get women to join auxiliary groups. Images like Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter in 1943 encouraged women to occupy the post vacated by men in the factories. While the pinups were supposed to be reassuring the soldiers of their virility and sexuality, they wanted to do it in a way that didn't exasperate their anxieties. So this is believed to be part of the strategy behind making the pinups so innocent and wholesome, not only to avoid the men being reminded that their beautiful wives and girlfriends also had needs that were going unmet while they were away at war, but also to encourage the women to remain chaste as well. Some women's magazines began offering images of pinups with advice on how to look more like them. So, as funny as it sounds, pinups were actually used to encourage sexual morality for both men and women. At least in the sense that they were trying to keep men from being seduced by someone overseas. As I mentioned earlier, they were concerned with the soldiers getting VDs, which of course is what nowadays we would call STDs or STIs. And they were also worried about spies taking advantage of these men's loneliness. In fact, this was such a big push by the government that soldiers were given pinup images for free. A new type of press developed designed specifically for soldiers. Yank was a magazine that was started during the Second World War and was published weekly. Now, this was modeled after the newspaper Stars and Stripes that had been around since the Civil War and came out daily to report on the news of what was happening during wartime. But Yank magazine was going to be used for a different purpose. The decision to publish pictures of women in these magazines was taken at the highest level by the military commanders and by the Secretary of War. The chiefs of staff of the armed forces considered pinups to be essential to maintaining the morale of the troops. These publications were free and delivered by post. In each editor's office, the selection of drawings or photos was subject to the precise criteria of chastity and good taste imposed by the military authorities. The pictures had to be erotic, but not pornographic. They should invoke nostalgia and dreams, without pushing things so far that the men grew frustrated or overly occupied with what they were lacking. Over the years of the war, the publishers of magazines, reviews, and calendars printed more and more pinups, which became more and more patriotic. Alberto Vargas is another of the most famous names in pinup. His Vargas girls graced the pages of Esquire magazine during the 1940s. They were best known for their sultry poses and ethereal beauty. Vargas helped to feed this need for patriotism by giving his creations a stereotypical American aspect and often dressing them in items of military attire, which were rarely complete. This allowed the women to be both erotic and patriotic. Aside from the freebies that soldiers were getting from Yank magazine, posters of pinup ladies were hung all over the cities and camps where the soldiers were stationed. One of the main propaganda techniques during World War II was to make men believe that if they went to war, women would love them and fall all over them. And for some, this actually did happen, since we know that there were so many war brides at the time. Men would hang these photos and illustrations in their bunks alongside images of their wives and girlfriends. The goal was for soldiers to focus on fighting to protect what was back at home, namely women and the promise of having a family, instead of focusing on the brutality of war. And it appeared to have worked, because when they returned home, they were ready to start a family, and it turned into an era that we now know as the baby boom. In the end, the popularity of pinups continued once the soldiers returned home, and as the post-war nuclear family developed, the pinups became more overtly female by increasing the sexuality in the photos and illustrations. And eventually, pinups were isolated to men's magazines, which we'll talk more about in a bit. As I touched on a bit earlier, towards the end of World War II, pinup girls made a glamorous switch from illustrations of unknown women to photographs of famous faces. This transition happened not only because photography was becoming more accessible, but also because real-life images were more relatable to the audience since they capture the charm of familiar faces. Female artist Zoe Mozart is also credited with influencing the switch from paintings of imaginary fantasy women to real-life women. While her paintings were still in the realm of make-believe, she worked to make the women more proportional to real life. Her illustrations depicted women with waists that were large enough to hold actual organs. From adverts to film posters and men's calendars, her realistic approach sold like hotcakes. The public wanted real women. As one of the most popular pinups among American troops, Betty Page was the first to make the transition from illustrations to photography. Her images appeared in countless publications, and she is the most photographed and collected pinup girl in history. Betty Grable, because apparently all their names were Betty, Betty Grable was famous for having the best legs in Hollywood. She was a successful actress, singer, and dancer in the 1940s. In 1943, her iconic yellow bathing suit poster made her the most famous pinup girl of the World War II era. The beautiful Eartha Kitt started her career as a pinup model in 1942. She was one of the first African-American women to be taken seriously in the genre, and the support she gained during her time as a pinup girl propelled her career forward. She acted in several Broadway musicals, put out her own albums, and starred in several movies, going down in history as one of the most successful African-American actresses of all time. Even Orson Welles called her the most exciting woman alive. You may know her song Santa Baby, which is still very popular and played on the radio to this very day. And in more recent years, she voiced the villain in the Disney movie The Emperor's New Groove. While Eartha got her start in pinup modeling, she never got into some of the more risque areas of the genre. And in fact, taking pictures in a pinup style became something that many famous actresses did when they first started out as a way to show off their bodies without revealing too much. By the summer of 1943, GIs were growing tired of the impersonal and over-sexualized illustrations of Hollywood pinups and started requesting photos of everyday women. Life magazine and regional newspapers compiled printing images of women who were from the same home states as the servicemen who were requesting these photos. These images gave the men a reminder of what they were fighting for in a way that glamorized Hollywood actresses could not. By the end of 1944, regional newspapers started having pinup contests where GIs would send in photographs of their mothers, wives, and children. These pinup mothers and children, unlike pinup girls and boys, reflected an under-acknowledged aspect of pinups that accentuated the ties of family, home, and stability and downplayed their sexuality, or in the case of pinup children, excluded that component altogether. So these completely took away the sexual side of the genre and fully leaned into the patriotic, don't forget who you are fighting for side of things. These pinups were mascots for the homesick, war-weary GIs who simply wanted to get back to their families. By 1950, pinups were fully integrated into pop culture and became an excellent means of advertising. As advertising icons, they served the consumer society by presenting a positive image of life, abundance, youth, and beauty. They symbolized a flourishing economy and radiant future, and they materialized the values of a victorious American society in full expansion. And this is around the time that advertisers really started to catch on to the fact that scantily clad women could make them millions. When Marilyn Monroe first arrived on the scene, she was trying to make it as a model and posed for a nude photograph. When she moved into acting, it seems as though she was trying to put that type of work behind her, but there were rumors that this risque photo of Marilyn existed, but no one seemed to have them. Marilyn Monroe's most famous scene from the movie 7 Year Itch, where the wind blows up from the New York subway and it blows up her skirt. This is a perfect example of what the pinup style lifestyle was supposed to be. This was one of those classic oops kind of moments where a woman who was normally innocent was placed in a situation where you almost get a glimpse of something that you shouldn't be seeing, but she doesn't reveal too much. In 1953, Hugh Hefner founded Playboy magazine. He had served in World War II, and he knew how much men loved pinup model photos. When they returned home from the war, it was very difficult for men to buy these kinds of materials, and it was illegal to send them through the mail. All magazines geared towards men were centered around hunting, fishing, and the outdoors. Publishing such a racy magazine was risky, but Hefner knew there was a large demand for this magazine and it would be a huge success. Now, about a year prior to him founding his magazine is when Marilyn Monroe's career as an actress was starting to take off. The majority of her roles were sexy but classy, and reportedly she was ashamed of the photos that she had posed for to make ends meet back in 1949. But the rumors about these photographs continued to persist, and when Hefner started his magazine 4 years later, he somehow managed to get his gross little grubby hands on the photo and purchased the rights from a calendar company. He then hitched his wagon to Marilyn Monroe's fame by putting her on the cover of the very first issue of Playboy magazine with the promise that her nude photograph was inside. Many men had heard about this photo, but very few had actually seen it. So this created a frenzy, and Hefner's magazine sold like hotcakes. Marilyn's photo made Hefner millions, but he never paid her a cent. In fact, the two of them never even met. Hefner's magazine sold by word of mouth and grew until it was selling over 1 million copies a month. For years, this whole genre had been considered disgraceful, but as more and more companies latched onto the idea that sex sells, it became more and more accepted to include suggestive pictures of women or hire beautiful young girls to attract more customers. For example, in the later 50s and 60s, it became mandatory for young flight attendants to be attractive, fit, and well-dressed. Now, I actually did an episode on flight attendants or stewardesses, as they were called back then, and how this type of thing changed perception and their uniforms over the years. So if you're enjoying this episode and haven't seen that one, make sure you go check it out after this one, because I had so much fun making that one. And if you look at the photographs of some of the stewardess uniforms back in the time, you can see how the fantasy of the stewardess clearly got its inspiration from pinup art. In the 1920s, form-fitting bathing suits were considered indecent and even illegal to wear on the beach. Just a few short decades later, Barbie dolls appeared on the scene wearing a revealing one-piece bathing suit and were being sold to little girls. I mean, it is mild by today's standard. Most of us wouldn't call it revealing today, but it was certainly risque for the time. The acceptance of the Barbie doll was just one more example of how public opinion on women's clothing had changed in a pretty short amount of time, in a large part due to the prevalence of the pinup. This is evidenced not only by the Barbie doll's clothing, but also by her hairstyle, makeup, and hourglass figure. Barbie also had women depicted in all kinds of careers other than housewives, which was another way that pinup girls had pushed the envelope. What had started out as a fantasy was now materializing into everyday real life. By the late 1950s, pinup, as it was previously known, started to die out. The pages of Playboy magazine included a number of Vargas girls into the late 1970s, but as mentalities and customs evolved, the playmate that accompanied men to the front lines during the Vietnam War was much less chaste than her forebears. And soon, the erotic tactics employed by war advertising were extended to all types of advertising in the 1950s and 60s. The photos being pinned up were removed from bedrooms and placed out in the garage. As the free love movement of the 1960s spread through the United States, the allure of innocence lost its luster, and magazines like Hustler pushed the envelope even further. The innocent girls who were being caught in a private moment were replaced by models who looked straight into the camera with sultry bedroom eyes. Over the next few decades, pinup artwork was seen as dated, but by the 2000s, people began to feel nostalgic for a time when the definition of sexy was much more innocent. Women are now embracing pinup more than ever, and there are several clubs and organizations that celebrate women's love for pinup and other opportunities for women to model in this vintage style. Retro is on the rise again, carrying the pinup tradition into the future. Back in the 1930s, when pinup was starting to reach its height of popularity, being a pinup model was considered to be shameful. Now, almost 100 years later, it is expected that actresses will pose for sexy photographs. Compared to today's version of sexy, the vintage pinup style is seen as more wholesome, and this is why some women enjoy modeling for this particular style of photography. In a world where entertainment is constantly trying to push the envelope of going one step further than the other guy, being edgy is often more profitable than playing it safe. Things that were once reserved for behind closed bedroom doors are now staring up at us at the checkout line at the grocery store. As the envelope continues to be pushed further and further, you have to wonder, how is this normalization and social acceptance of overly sexualized content affecting our children and our society as a whole? Go up here with me. Got a friend. No, hi, friend. Okay, I got really cute for this episode, and she's gonna sit here and take all my limelight.